Hello students. Today we will be discussing the topic globalization and state welfare. We will begin this topic by asking three questions. Number 1. How does globalization affect state welfare? Number 2. Is this new wave of globalization necessitating a restructuring of state welfare provision? Number 3. Has globalization done away with the need to provide welfare provision since it has brought about economic prosperity for all? Let us try to answer these three questions in the new age of globalization. Before we move on with whether state welfare is necessary or should be undermined, we need to know what is globalization and how has it affected states' provision of social welfare. Globalization, we already know, is a dominant world phenomenon representing a technological, economic, and political integration of the world. Under the influence of globalization, borders between countries lose importance and no longer stand as a barrier to the development of economy, finances, and communications worldwide. The world is progressively becoming a global market in which products, services, and ideas are available to everybody, everywhere, at any point of time. Private property and individual freedoms represent its face. Its motive powers are economic efficiency and democracy, which basically reflect profit and increase in capital. Numerous authors emphasize the fact that the greatest threat to globalization is globalization itself. Since its protagonists believe it had attained the ultimate values that should be imposed throughout the world. The advent of globalization has strongly affected and influenced the paradigm of historical welfare states, driving its objective and policy guidelines towards a new path, which means that the entire paradigm of state welfare has attained a new era of being questioned whether we need state welfare or it can be safely done away with. The characteristics of a new path of globalization have much to do with the latitude of empowerment of sovereign states and with their ability to determine social cohesion and prevent adverse social effects of global competitiveness. So when we are speaking of global competitiveness, how does the general mass of common people factor herein? Global competitiveness is also about competitiveness of states and between states. Modern states develop different initiatives and endeavors to attract multinational private corporations and investments, but are modern states socially competitive as well? Do they have the ability to make a difference implementing aggressive policies leading to social cohesion and therefore preventing the emergence of globalization losers? Which means that is the social policy discourse influenced by the forces of economic globalization or not? In recent years, welfare states have been the subject of increasing political ideological debates over the effects and effectiveness. Most advanced Western states appear committed towards reducing social expenditure and to introducing measures like labor market deregulation and lower tax rate, which facilitates greater economic competitiveness, but impact adversely on rates of poverty and inequality. That is the reason why a large majority of scholarly literature have emphasized that in the era of globalization, poverty and inequality has increased. These economic and political initiatives have coincided with the period of intense economic globalization. What is very interesting to observe is the growing salience of international trade, investment, production, and financial flows appear to be curtailing the autonomy of the individual nation states. In particular, globalization appears to be highly encouraging, if not demanding, a decline in social spending and standards. So, this is the demand of globalization to cut down on social expenditure. This particular lecture seeks to examine the impact of globalization on welfare states. The influence of globalization on individual nation states can be best understood by exploring the political and ideological forces locally and internationally which are seeking either to retrench or retain the welfare state. Countries along the world have two options: either bring in more welfare or completely refrain from offering welfare provisions. References will be made here to the argument advanced by Bob Deacon in his seminal work Global Social Policy, International Organizations and the Future of Welfare. In this book, he has raised the fact that globalization has raised social policy issues to a supranational level, and the global supranational agencies and institutions are exerting increasing influence on the shaping of national social policies. Whilst many of these international organizations are currently supportive of the neoliberal project to retrench welfare, there is evidence of increasing resistance to this agenda at the international as well as the local level. Now, economic globalization seemed to have fueled by the collapse of communism and in the absence of any alternative to the free market discourse. The term economic globalization refers to the shift in the scale of social and economic relations from the regional to national and the global level. Processes such as high-tech communications, lower transportation costs, and the unrestricted trade are perceived to have influences in transforming the world into one integrated global market. A number of authors view globalization as transferring power from the national to the uncontrollable market forces and new economic actors in terms of transnational corporations, international economic institutions, and other financial institutions are greatly shaping the social policy discourse both in advanced as well as developing countries of the world. Concern is expressed that these trends have important ramifications for the sovereignty and autonomy of individual states. And students, please note that state welfare falls within the internal autonomy of the sovereign states. Now, if sovereign states do not have the power to decide on the range of state welfare and their power to offer state welfare policies are controlled by external supranational and international agencies, then there is a natural question of what happens to state welfare in the absence of any autonomy to carry forward with state welfare provisions. Can international markets curtail state-led welfare measures? Now, let us try to understand what does the scholarly literature have to say on the influence of globalization on social welfare regimes. Authors such as Weisman, Fincher and Weber, Weiss, Hurst and Thompson are more skeptical and reject the notion that global actors are overwhelmingly displacing national political and economic power networks. They argue instead that globalization tendencies remain subject to autonomous responses and outcome within particular nation states. This debate is crucial to understand the future of advanced welfare states. Those who view globalization as an all-powerful measure argue that all national states are being increasingly pushed towards adopting a common model of highly deregulated, privatized, and liberalized capitalism. Under this model, states are forced to offer lower and lower taxes in order to compete for footloose private investment. While some social democratic governments attempted to resist this trend, they are arguably limited to acting as reluctant neoliberals whose policies inevitably drift towards their right-wing counterparts. The heroic but ultimately unsuccessful attempt of the Swedish Social Democrats to save full employment benefits completely illustrate this point of view. The best they appear to be able to do is slow down the erosion of social benefits and to ensure a more equitable policy of retrenchment whereby the poor and the disadvantaged are protected. One important thing we need to know is that under the forces of globalization, most of the erstwhile social welfare states are also bringing about a change in the social welfare provisions. For example, in the erstwhile system of providing full employment, states are providing for contractual employment. While erstwhile they had the system of providing full pension policies to retired public sector employees, now they are coming out with limited benefits in terms of social security provisions. In contrast, we find that right-wing governments enthusiastically pursue an agenda of retrenchment and privatization of social protection, which means individuals have to fund for their own social protection. It should be noted that globalization is as much political, as much ideological phenomena as it is economic. Consequentially, globalization leads inevitably to the decline of the welfare state through the vetoing of initiatives towards greater social expenditure and full employment by international financial markets. Even the long-term Scandinavian welfare advocate Esping Anderson argues that globalization has narrowed domestic policy choices and that states are highly vulnerable to international trade, finance, and capital movements. Consequently, welfare states face a fundamental trade-off between employment, growth and efficiency, and egalitarian social protection. Goodwin and others, for example, utilizing a comparative study of Holland, Germany and USA, argue that social democratic welfare regimes equal or exceed the performance of corporatist and liberal regimes across all social and economic objectives. In addition, research by Garrett and Michel refutes the proposition that increased global capital and capital mobility necessarily leads to welfare cuts. Similarly, Hurst and Thompson argue that individual states retain considerable political flexibility in their response to globalization. Thus, the scholarly literature puts in two clear-cut arguments. On the one hand, some of them argue that globalization has not led to reduction in social welfare provisions. Others argue that globalization and forces of liberalization and privatization has definitely diminished state welfare provisions. Thus, national policy responses to globalization are not uniform and continue to reflect the ideological and political tradition of individual states. Hence, it is important to note there we cannot provide a clear-cut solution to whether welfare states have decreased or increased. In fact, the entire system of social security provision varies from one system to another system. The debate about the effects of economic globalization is complicated by the increasing influence of international organizations and institutions on national social policies. These include global institutions like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the International Labour Organizations, UNICEF, supranational bodies like OECD, European Union, and supranational non-governmental agencies like Oxfam. According to Bob Deacon, globalization has raised social policy issues to a supranational level. So, social policy measures are no longer confined to domestic national politics. He defines the scope of global social policy as including social redistribution between countries. Global social regulation in terms of trade and the operation of firms in the interest of social protection and welfare objectives, social provision, empowerment at a level above that of national government. And if you look into the very important United Nations organization on the High Commission for Refugees, we can see how social provisions are not just confined to national level but have also been taken up in the agenda of the United Nations. Bob Deacon refers to three particular manifestations of this global social policy discourse, by virtue of which we will be able to understand social policy regimes in different countries of the world. The first one, he says, is about economic competition between countries may lead them to shed the economic costs of social protection in order to be more competitive unless there are global regulations in place to prevent such actions. So he says that global competition forces many states to shed off their social welfare provisions. The second important reason that he gives is international migratory pressures provoke considerations of income transfers between nations in order to alleviate the political consequences of mass migration. The third reason is common regional markets in capital and labor could lead to the possibility of an international authority providing at a global or regional level the social rights denied or threatened at a national level. So there are these three factors which actually shape the defining moments of the social welfare discourse. Now there is another way through which globalization and the state welfare discourse can be understood. This discourse can also be understood from the demand side and the supply side intervention. A whole body of research has emerged to address the relationship between the increasing internationalization of production and the provision of social security, but has arrived at contradictory conclusions. Proponents of the so-called compensation hypothesis argue that globalization leads to welfare state expansion as governments strive to compensate potential globalization threats for the risk associated with increasing international competition and volatility. The argument essentially has two sides. As I just said, a demand side and a supply side. On the demand side, it holds that globalization increases voters' demand for social protection, which governments cannot undermine. On the supply side, governments satisfy this demand by supplying for a more generous welfare state. Other scholars, however, doubt this explanation. They opine that globalization leads to welfare state expansion. One group of skeptic scholars focus on the supply side and point to government's reduced ability to provide for social spending in a world characterized by mobile capital. They argue that even if globalization increases demand for more social production, it creates efficiency dynamics that constrains government's ability to supply it. To put it simply, even though there is a demand for more social protection, it depends on the government's ability to provide for those social protection measures. A second group of critics challenge this compensation hypothesis. Focusing on the demand side, these scholars reject the notion that globalization affects the demand for welfare state expansion at all. Many authors find that higher integration into the world economy coincides with bigger welfare states, either because integration increases domestic economic volatility or globalization induced structural adjustment has actually led to greater funding of welfare measures. These supporting findings of the compensation thesis has been challenged by a number of studies. Now, some authors focus on the fact that openness volatility welfare nexus, wherein they find that changes in economic openness and globalization have had a negative impact on public spending. Other authors argue for a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between state welfare and globalization. Thus, we can see that globalization has a dual influence on welfare states. The first one resulted from the liberalized international trade regime starting, say, from the 1970s, while the other is related to the economic activity dematerialization as a consequence of the technological changes that followed 1990s. This dematerialization is explained as of the fact that a great majority of us make money out of thin air. This is very interesting. Leadburton, an economist, have analyzed the fact that there is more money circulating in the economy, and this money can be found in thin air. To quote him, we produce something that we cannot be easily measured or touched. The performance of our work does not stand piled up in a port, stored in a warehouse, or loaded in a freight train. Most of us make our living by rendering services or giving opinions, information and analysis, and we are all doing invisible work. So we are making money out of thin air by doing things that cannot be seen. Besides, the demands of the post-industrial society are increasing for specialized and highly trained workers, while non-qualified workers with low wages and uncertain jobs are less and less required. So he is of the opinion that when people are earning more and more, and when you require different kinds of skills which is easily available, obviously the question of low wages giving to workers is not required. The gap between highly qualified, well-paid labor and non-qualified labor is even greater, and the latter are becoming a new burden on the welfare state. So he is saying that it is this gap between qualified and non-qualified labor which is actually posing a challenge to this neoliberal welfare state concept. A special paradox of the welfare state reflects the fact that the number of poor has not decreased in spite of enormous funds being pumped into the economic system, which is a very, very amazing trend that can be seen. Even if the advent of more welfare social provisions is being seen, this has not led to a greater diminishing of poverty or inequality among people. Related to this, the question has been raised, which is completely logical at this point, whether the welfare state is able to resolve the problem caused by globalization, reflected in a national economic competitive positive decline on the one hand, and we can see there is an increase in poverty and inequality on the other. So we can see two contradictory trends. One, rise in economic prosperity, on the other hand, rise in poverty and inequality also. The welfare state concept has been challenged irrespective of the fact whether it succeeded in the past or it has failed in the present. The advocates of this argument have put in the fact that fiscal and economic efficiency crisis of the welfare state is also leading to a moral crisis. This is another part of the argument that they have put forth, that the welfare state crisis is also leading to a moral crisis. This view is supported by pointing out that welfare beneficiaries are unknown individuals and the money to be given to them is raised to enormous tax burdening. At the same time, this social package does not imply any obligation or initiative nor any energy devotion by its beneficiaries, which means that this entire package given to the beneficiaries does not pay back to the state in any beneficial form. Evident problems of welfare state can be seen. Now, the welfare state is not a solution. Many a times welfare state provisions create problems for the state itself. Now, the problems develop due to structural changes caused by globalization, which can be explained either by the argument of economic and fiscal crisis or by the argument of the rise of neoconservative ideologies. At the same time, we need to understand that it is not possible to refer to justice and moral reasoning or by emphasizing legitimacy of the existing welfare state concepts. New patterns have emerged where we find that there is a new concept related to welfare state, and that is the concept of the economic man. The welfare state, therefore, in the post-1990s have opened up the question for reforms. We need to reform conservative ideas on state welfare and provisions. Some believe that it is the forces of globalization that has led to welfare state crisis, forcing it to introduce retrenchment measures, whereas others holding the opposing view argue that globalization stimulates development. The third group suggests a possibility of welfare state adjustment to globalization, and it is dependent on country-specific development measures. Finally, there are opinions who believe that globalization has just no influence on state welfare. Regardless of the different views about the relationship between globalization and state welfare, it is undeniable and practice-driven fact that its functioning caused a rise in expenses which directly threatened national economy effectiveness, thus endangering the capacity of furthering financing social needs. Now, what are the problems faced by social welfare states? The first problem is socio-democratic, which is usually applied in Scandinavian countries. Its essence is reflected in opening new jobs in the public sector, by which not only the problem was not resolved, but it also aggravated in the increase of public expenditure, induced a raise of welfare social costs. So, if you are opening public employment, that is also not an answer to social welfare crisis. The second corporative approach tries to solve the problem of state welfare by reducing labor supply by giving them early retirement. Third neoliberal approach, which has been implemented in USA, Great Britain, Australia and New Zealand, relied on labor market liberalization, causing increased labor demand and flexibility of wages, bringing about increase in inequality and poverty. Thus, we find different doses of state welfare came in with different degrees of state welfare problems. However, it should be noted that the question whether the state should deal with social welfare and security ideologically has been wrongly raised, because we need to understand that social welfare is also related to human instincts. For example, solidarity. It is undisputable that there is no need to help the helpless or the poor. Rather, it is commonly accepted around the world that social welfare provision should be directed towards the helpless, the poor, the needy and the marginalized. The question that varies is how much or what degree of social welfare should be provided. The increase of public expenditure may, regardless of the humanitarian component, have an adverse impact on the economic system, as it can slow down the system as well as burden the industry. Thus, we find that the more social welfare provisions are there is an increasing burden on the taxpayer, leading to eventual directing of the funds on social welfare and less on economic development. Let us try to understand how does this globalization and welfare impact the post-communist states. What happened to state welfare after the collapse of the Soviet bloc? Since 1989, the leading East Central European accession states like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic has experienced radically different state welfare developments than from their neighbors of the former Soviet Union. The Europe effect can be used to explain the source of this differentiation, and this effect argues that globalization has not had a uniform impact on post-communist welfare states. Rather, the effect of globalization differs greatly depending on a country's position in international relations and the globalized economy. Countries closer to the European Union have used welfare state programs to compensate citizens for the traumas of system transition and economic openness, while former Soviet states have allowed their welfare state to collapse to a far greater extent. Now we call them the European and the Eurasian transition. Post-communist states have experienced two kinds of transition so far as welfare states are concerned. In a comprehensive study of the post-communist state welfare adjustment, the World Bank found that in the first decade of transition, post-communist states separated into two categories of adjustment, European and Eurasian. According to the World Bank, the European category included the East Central European countries, for example, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia. The more successful Balkan and the Yugoslav republics, Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, etc. The Eurasian category encompassed the former Soviet republics such as Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Ukraine, and the Baltics. Compared to the Eurasian countries, the European countries restructured economies more aggressively and effectively after 1991. The European transition countries experienced less transitional recessions and their per capita income were higher. All these factors pointed to the direction of higher welfare state spending for the European transition countries. Since pensions are usually considered to be one of the most favorable cash social benefit in the most communist countries, this gives a good sense of the direction and magnitude of changes in welfare state spending. The World Bank data concludes that overall economic, social and administrative performance since 1989 is a good indicator of the total social spending in the late 1990s. Despite starting with similar welfare state structures, European and Eurasian countries have dramatically diverged from the first phase of transition. Now, you need to understand that welfare state crisis has been conditioned not only by the challenges of globalization regardless of efficiency or competitiveness, but also by the fact that they have contributed to societal disintegration and increase of poverty. All the countries therefore are forced to seek solution in a post-globalized world so as to minimize poverty and inequality. However, this can only be achieved economic efficiency is increased. As a final word of conclusion, it has to be noted that globalization has both a positive as well as a negative impact on state welfare. The ultimate impact of state welfare provisions and the social policy discourse is largely shaped by the individual country's conditioning to adapt itself to greater or lesser social security programs. Thank you.